Would you welcome Joe Willey as our speaker today?
Well, good afternoon. We're going to have a lot of fun together. That's the way I look upon my presentation. And before I get started, let me give you just a little bit of background. There was a young boy that went to Sabbath school, and after he came home, his mother said to him, "What did you learn today in Sabbath school?" And he said, "Well, my teacher told us about Moses building a pontoon bridge across the Red Sea. And they were running away from the Egyptians with their tanks. And as they got around the corner, they climbed a hill, and Moses radioed to God up in heaven and said, 'Can you send over those B-52s and bomb those tanks in the..." His mother said, whoa, did your teacher tell you the story like that?" He said, "No, but if I told it the way she told it, you wouldn't believe it." So the story that I'm going to tell you this afternoon, I hope you will believe, and we're going to need a little bit of coaching along the way. I would like for you to spend the afternoon with me being a scientist. And if you failed math or had trouble in chemistry in preparation for your scientific degree, maybe you'd just like to be a historian. In either case, let me present to you the evidence that has been given to us, and you decide, on the basis of which I lay out the documentation, whether there is sufficient evidence to make these conclusions or not. As a scientist, we maintain fairly high standards. That is, we only believe in those things for which we have the evidence, and we do not believe in those things for which we do not have the evidence or our reasoning to see through the experimental information that we obtain. In other words, good scientific practice doesn't allow you to make things up. If you have gaps in your information, then you've got to return to the laboratory and fill those in. Recently, for example, there are two books that have appeared. One is titled "The Prophet and Her Critics." A striking new analysis refutes the charges that Ellen White borrowed the health messages. And the other one is titled "Acquired or Inspired." Actually, the work is done by Don McMahon and Leonard Brand as a scientist at Loma Linda University, trying to give a little bit more scientific background to the work that Don McMahon has done, put his name on this book, and they show up as joint authors on "The Prophet and Her Critics." But really, the information that we're going to talk about is derived from Don McMahon, an eyes and ears and throat surgeon in Australia. So my goal is to present his data using the scientific methodologies and the logic of science to determine whether or not it's probable or practical to find, through scientific methodologies, inspiration in the health gospels of Ellen White. This is not a seminar on whether or not Ellen White is inspired. I want you to stay focused on the task at hand. The scientific data that we will review will determine the outcome of your response. I first heard about this when I listened to a seminar in Portland, Oregon, in which one of the speakers said that there was some scientific information to prove beyond reasonable doubt something on the order of 10 to the minus 25 chance of Mrs. White having selected her messages by random choice. And it sounded so far out that I decided I'd look into it. Being a scientist, when somebody perks your interest in a topic like this, you want to find out whether it's true or not. So I picked up Don McMahon's book, and I quote from him, "The convenient way of visualizing what is meant by Ellen White having a 1.4 times 10 to the 25th chance of achieving her results by random selection is to imagine a pile of wheat 50 miles high across the United States in which there's placed a single grain of rice, and a chicken would walk across this pile of wheat and with a single peck pick that one bit of rice. I thought, as a scientist, I can't imagine anything being quite that possible. So I began to look into this research further to determine how reliable it is, and that is the documentations which I'd like to present to you this afternoon. In the course of doing this research myself, I contacted Don McMahon, and he and I carried on a lengthy email exchange. At one point, he, in fact, admitted to me that he never did the scientific calculations or the mathematical calculations to determine this, but that he relied upon a professor in Australia. The professor in Australia then wrote to Don and said, "I agree with T. Joe that figures like 11 standard deviations and probabilities of 10 to the 24th power are fairly meaningless." Oh, as a scientist, that makes you alert, right? Maybe there's something going on here. When I first did these calculations for you, talking to Don, I knew this was going to be the case. Now, if there's one thing that scientists admire, it's the care with which data is presented. We do not, as scientists, allow individuals to just sort of make up stories or calculations or present data that looks like it favors our position just out of the hat. So as far as I was concerned, and I went a little bit deeper into calculations, it's totally nonsense. So let's just put aside the probability part of this thing, and let me illustrate this by showing you what I mean by probabilities. Notice this tire coming down, this car, and the tire comes off, hits the car, hits another car, bounces across, hits this car, up and down, back and forth, goes across the other lane, comes across, hits this pole, bang, goes across, and then notice what happens about here. Boom. What is the probability of that happening? Well, what you just saw, is only half of what Don McMahon is saying about Ellen White. That's only 10 to the 10th. He's claiming 10 to the 28th power. So instead of the tire going back and forth, 10 times, it needed to go 20 times to achieve the same effect. One thing that's going to be important in our discussions is for you to understand about science and how it works. And in the process, we ask the question, to what extent does God involve himself in nature? Over on the far extreme is supernaturalism, particularly the naive supernaturalist, who believes that God is in everything. Every event that takes place in nature is God invoked, God inspired, God regulated, and so forth. This is the area that scientists do not participate in, not very much at least. Now, occasionally, on the other extreme is scientific naturalism, where scientists tend to preoccupy themselves in their study. But in between, I've made this as a continuum. There can be variations in people's attitudes about the role that God plays in nature and in their lives. In the middle here is one that I call occasionalism. In this position, the links to causation are merely perceptions. One thing doesn't actually cause another. It only marks the occasion at which God acts. For example, one day one of the deans at the Loma Linda School, I won't tell you which one, was driving down the road to Banning. He and his wife were going to look at a piece of property that they had decided to purchase. And on the way, a car from the other side crossed over the barrier and struck them, and he interpreted that to mean God was acting to inform him he should not buy that property, so he immediately turned around after he recovered his wits about him from the hospital and went to the real estate office and canceled the contract. That is the kind of occasionalism that I'm talking about. Over here where you and I are going to be this afternoon in scientific naturalism, we're concerned about practical methods for acquiring knowledge. And we're going to use methodologies and logic of reasoning in order to achieve our position. Now, I don't really want to completely spend the afternoon educating you about how science works, but many of you, for example, subscribe to Scientific American Discovery, or you watch television programs, so you get kind of the general feel about how science conducts their activities. James White, for example, in the Review and Herald, recommended that every Adventist subscribe to Scientific American, and oftentimes in the review, he quoted from Scientific American. Here's a little quote I want to leave you with from Stephen Gould, written in 1996, an individual from Harvard University that many scientists admire because of his prolific communication skills. And keep this in mind as we go through the process of looking at the data that I'm going to lay out on the table for you. Quote, "The more important the subject and the closer it cuts to the bone of our hopes and needs, the more we are likely to err in establishing a framework for analysis. This means simply that even scientists are humans, and when they have a pet project or a pet research or something that they have dwelt upon for many years, it's very painful to discover an ugly little fact that destroys their whole concept, and they've got to start all over again. But that's the way science works. So, Don McMahon and Leonard Brand, in launching this project to discover the scientific basis of Ellen White's supernatural, should face an ugly little fact that might, in fact, undermine their whole concept. And we may discover that later today. Now, it's very important for you to recognize that I am not against the lifestyle of Adventism. I admire our lifestyle. Look what it does. On the average, Adventist men live 7.3 years. That's another 7.5 years of torment and torture to my lovely wife. And Adventist women live 4.4, longer than other Californians. This is based upon 5 relatively simple health behaviors promoted by the Adventist Church: no smoking or drinking, eating a plant-based diet, eating nuts on occasion, and regular exercise to maintain normal body weight. There was a cartoon about this recently. Dogbird, I don't understand why you or anybody would become a vegetarian. You mean, why don't I take dead animals, cook them until they become carcinogenic, then eat them instead of something nutritious? Is that your question? Exactly. If there is any good reason, have you joined a cult? I live in Loma Linda. Now, the first question I want to have you deal with me this afternoon: why was health reform so important to the Seventh-day Adventists? It did not come out of the William Miller movement. It basically appeared much later. And James White gives one of the best definitions, at least for the time that I have found, this taken from the Health Reformer in November 1870. Seventh-day Adventists have brought their hearts up before the realities of the near future and have made the soon advent a matter of practical consideration. Now is the time to perfect the moral fitness necessary for the change of our vile bodies at that great event. The moral change must take place now in order for the change to immortality then. In other words, in a few illustrative expressions, James White and other pioneers believed that Jesus Christ had not appeared as promised. Something is wrong. And in their desire to be perfect or achieve a form of perfection, they took on the body and adopted health reform. Health reform became a significant part of the Advent movement. In fact, as George Reed says, the zeal and the emphasis which soon began to give to health teachings and the health work almost overshadowed the third angel's message itself for a time. Okay, so far so good. We have the reason for the health message. We have its presence in the culture. Now, how did it begin? Many people, in fact most that I run across, believe that it launched on a single event called a vision to the spirit of prophecy on June 6, 1863. Well, as scientists, we want to test that idea. So I went into the Review and Herald on the archives and printed out all references to stomach, lungs, feet, water, fresh air, smoking, tea, coffee, tobacco, all those things that make up health reform. And I measured with a rule the amount of space devoted in the issue to that subject. And surprisingly, when it came to tobacco, most of the articles in the review starting around 1853 were written by non-Adventists. So Adventists were willing to accept information from non-Adventist authors. Only a few Adventists, here shown in the blue in this graph, wrote about tobacco. And think about it, that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? In fact, the major article on tobacco occurred in the review in 1855. When it came to other parts of the health message, sort of the conglomerate of health ideas, written by both Adventists and non-Adventists, they were about equal. Non-Adventists contributed just about as often to the review as the Adventist authors such as Loughborough, Haskell, Snook, James White himself, and many others. Now, the other thing I noticed was that many of these references by the non-Adventists were appearing in the review from health journals all across America. And the reason for that is, and more research, so I'm laying this out on the table for you to discover, is in 1792, the U.S. Postal Act permitted any magazine or newspaper to send to anybody else that was in their business like them a free copy. So the Review and Herald received free copies from Hall's Health Journal, free copies from the Phrenology Journal by Wells and Fowler. And these journals were quoted from time to time, by the editors of the Review. Now, Mrs. White's vision occurred in June of 1863, about in here, but by this time there was a sudden acceleration of interest in the health message by the Adventists before the vision. Notice that this graph here in 1862, why do you suppose it's less? Any reasons that you might think it might be less? Civil War was going. The Review devoted a little bit of exposure, not much, but a little bit exposure to the Civil War. Remember James White in The Nation, August of 1862, pled with the Adventist community, don't get involved with the war. Jesus is coming soon. There is no possibility that slavery will be removed in America because Revelation 13 says there will always be slaves. Well, I think what was happening here is the contest for organizing the church and adopting the name Seventh-day Adventist, and there was a lot of struggle over that adoption. Look how close. This is a member of the church. On February 26, 1857, William McAndrew. Look how close he writes to the editor and encompasses basically the health reform message. I quote, "I agree with you fully as regards tea, tobacco, and etc. And in my practice for 5 years have gone further than that, for there are a great many other things in common use that are very prejudicial to health and body and mind, so closely connected that what impairs the body vigor darkens and clouds the mind." That's fairly straightforward, isn't it? He went on to explain about eating swine's flesh, the fat of animals, and other abominations. The constant use of superfine flour and concentrated victuals, highly seasoned, are among the many inventions which help to ruin our race, that make us a miserable, short-lived, groaning people. Wheat is one of the best grains for the nutrition of man, that a vegetable diet, as it is called, without animal food of any kind, is far the best for ensuring health of body and vigor of mind. The light on this subject has been very abundant for many years. Howard the philanthropist, and Isaac Newton, and a host of others who subsisted on plain, wholesome diet and accomplished great things give abundant testimony to its superiority. This would give you, if you were a member of the Adventist church in this period, at least a feeling that Adventists were considering or thinking about health reform. What I did notice in the review was particularly this tobacco cessation. Here are just 2 quick notes I pull up for your review. This individual, Brother Tucker, in September 1860, says to the editor, "I was an inveterate smoker. I vainly thought that I could go through to the kingdom, pipe in my mouth, and tobacco box in my pocket. Vain thought. I soon learned that cleanliness and holiness must go together. The brethren warned me kindly." Who are the brethren? These are the preachers that are traveling back and forth through the Northeast and down into the West, as it was called then, into Ohio and Illinois and so forth. Here's Brother Sister Brewster, 1860. "My husband has used tobacco 45 years, but thinks it's best to serve God by denying himself the use of the filthy weed. It has been a hard struggle, but he has conquered, the Lord assisting him." So there was a movement generating in the Adventist culture before the vision, the so-called far-reaching vision of Ellen White in 1863. Now, around the midsummer of 1863, Mrs. White began lecturing against drugs and flesh meats and in favor of water, pure air, rest, and proper diet, the same subject of the popular health reformers. During this time, she said the people that she spoke to often said to her, quote, taken from the Review and Herald, October 8, 1867, "You speak very nearly the opinions taught in the Laws of Life and other publications by Drs. Trawl, Jackson, and others. Have you read that paper and those works?" My reply was, I had not. Neither should I read them, till I have fully written out my views, lest it should be said that I had received my light upon the subject of health from physicians and not from the Lord. So this is pretty clear that the message that Ellen White is bringing to the church is focused through visions and from the throne of God on high. Well, this idea was challenged by a historian who at the time was at Loma Linda University, but it was uncomfortable for him to remain after he published this book, and he became a member of the history department at the University of Wisconsin, where he is today. Ron Number's book titled Prophets of Health, a Study of Ellen G. White, now in its 3rd edition. Leonard Brand and Don McMahon were very critical of raw numbers. And the reason for their book, those two books that I showed you at the beginning, focus on raw numbers. They disagree with Ronnie. Leonard Brand says that Numbers seems to have chosen a particular set of data in writing his book. He used strictly anecdotal evidence. In scientific language, historical language, this means that the professional that did the work is phony. He's just picking out what he perceives will support his views and ignoring the rest. Now, scientists cannot do this. Historians cannot do this. They do it, but it's not considered to be part of the standard that disciplines the science and historians. Here's where they had their major grievance with raw numbers, because Ronnie said in the beginning of the preface, quote, "I have tried to be as objective as possible. Thus, I have refrained from using divine inspiration as an historical explanation. This doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but as a professional historian or as a scientist, we'd have the same problem. You cannot resort, if you're going to retain your credentials, to divine inspiration." The trouble, as far as they were concerned, is that Numbers concluded that Mrs. White received her principles from the Reform movement rather than, as she claimed, from God-given visions. He said about neither to defend nor to damn her. Remember, the health reform movement in America, the first movement, began in 1820 and reached its apogee in 1860. So by the time the Adventists jumped into health reform, it was on the trailing edge of the reform movement. It was dying out at that point. And there was a lot of information in tracts, pamphlets, books, lectures about health reform across this country. So Leonard Brand, being a scientist, sets up two hypotheses. This is a good thing to do, of course. So here they are. Hypothesis number one. Ellen White health concepts can be satisfactorily explained as borrowed from the other health reformers of her day. In other words, what Ron Numbers says. Or hypothesis number two, and I've argued to him that there are multiple hypotheses, not just two, but we'll stick with these two. The second one is that Ellen White's health writings contain information that cannot be explained as arising from the health concepts available in her day. They show that she must have received information from an extra human source, where that means, in his world, God, divine, or from the supernatural. So now we, the members of my audience, as scientists, must look at the data and determine which of these two hypotheses did these two authors establish. Did Ellen White borrow from the community of health reformers of her day, or did she receive information extra human outside of that source? And then they make this fairly rigorous, what I call a drop-dead hypothesis. It's fatal. If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message that the Lord has not spoken. Watch out from Deuteronomy 18:22. So this is their quote from Brand and McMahon. These texts make it clear. We can expect to hear both from good prophets who speak for God and from false prophets whom God has not inspired. God has given us the right and, in fact, the responsibility to distinguish between them. The test is their fruit, the accuracy of what they have said or written. We are not being presumptuous when we challenge the work of Ellen White and examine it for accuracy, because God has asked us to discriminate between genuine and false prophets. If Ellen White health principles are from God, the evidence will verify it. All right, fair enough. That's a little bit stretching the risk, so to speak. I'm not sure as a scientist I would want to put my hypothesis to the test under those conditions. The reason is, before they began this study, and if I was supervising this research, I would have told them about this information. We already know, if you've been following the evidence, that Ellen White was entangled as a child of her culture with things around her. She wasn't living in isolation. I quote to you. Here, James White, 3 days after the vision, 1863, quote, "She has a vast amount of moral and religious reading which she has been collecting during the past 15 years, from which she is selecting and compiling these tracts." So James White, who oftentimes is marketing the products of her labors in writing, he's pretty straightforward about this. In The Health Reformer, he says, discussing the pamphlet How to Live, James White said, quote, "They each contain a lengthy article by Mrs. W. on diseases and their causes, but they were made chiefly from the most spirited and valuable articles and extracts from Trawl, Jackson, Graham, D.L. Lewis, Coles, Horace Mann, and John Gunn, and many others." February 1871. Reed, Sound of Trumpets, published by the Review and Herald, 1982. Quote, "If Mrs. White needed to buttress her position with false claims, she certainly was clumsy in selecting this issue. Far better to speak where one could be so easily checked, for the writings of the health reformers were everywhere, and people could certainly raise questions about the similarity with them. To issue false claims here speaks either of gross naivete or sheer foolishness." Or Fred Veltman, more recently, in 1990, wrote, quote, "How do you harmonize Ellen White's use of sources with her statements to the contrary? As of now, I do not have, does anyone else have, a satisfactory answer to this important question." Even Don McMahon, in his own book, wrote, quote, "A second problem with Ellen White's writings on health is that she appears to have gained many of her ideas from the knowledge of her time." So these two investigators already know that hypothesis 1 is likely, wouldn't you say, on the basis of the evidence already existing about the testimony of her time. Now, so I wrote to Don and I asked him to give me the background of his book, Acquired or Inspired. And here's some summary of what he wrote to me. The General Conference reviewed McMahon for over a year, and then the Australasian Division another 6 months. So this tells me, as a scientist, as a historian, that there's something about this book that is sensitive. We can't just, it's not just going to go through rapidly. In fact, McMahon had to remove several chapters from this book, including one on an appeal to mothers, one of the earliest writings of Ellen White. And I was shown another chapter, and he was not allowed to include material from How to Live, which represents 25% of her writings in the early period. The thing they did not like about my book was, up until halfway through, it was very clear that I was fighting against my strong prejudice against Ellen White being inspired. This change that was forced upon him as a condition of getting his book published by the church, he claims did not compromise my research for these changes. Well, let me ask you something. If you're a scientist, a historian, and you're trying to get something published, and the publisher tells you, we'll publish this if you remove, did you have to give up some of your fundamentals, your fundamental beliefs? My mission, he says to me, is to break down the concept that Ellen White was verbally inspired. So, should we go on? We already know what Don McMahon, the author of the book, inspired or acquired, what his disposition is, in a way. But let's go on and see. Maybe he was able to pull this, the second half, out of the woods. Here's the study group that he used. I call this the Ellen G. White Study Group. The first book that Ellen White wrote after her vision of 1863, which was published in the spring of 1864, was entitled An Appeal to Mothers. She claimed to have special light on masturbation, and she had been, as she claimed, careful not to read other chastity reformers. Don McMahon doesn't know this, but in 1832 in Portland, Maine, Mary Gove published a similar book with the same number of pages with the same title. And so she had access as a child of 12 years of age, presumably, to a previous publication on masturbation. In fact, I took that publication and Ellen White's publication, and with the computer asked it to tell me where's the source, and it linked it right directly across to Mary Gove. So Don McMahon may have known this, and this is the reason why he did not include this in his study. If you're a scientist, can you pick and choose your data? Well, yes, of course, if it doesn't meet certain standards. The only one that he did pick here in his study is in spiritual gifts, a relatively small little piece of 31 pages, found in volume 4A of spiritual gifts titled Health. And we'll say more about this because this is the closest writings that you have of Ellen White to the vision, where she claims that she read no other sources. After she published this one, she began to read as she claims. Over here in How to Live, these 6 pamphlets were largely extracted from other writers of which she did not give attributions. But this was not included in Don McMahon's research. In 1909, Ellen White reinforces her views about the origin of her health principles, where they came from. Seventh-day Adventists are handling momentous truths. More than 40 years ago, the Lord gave us special light on health reform. It is our duty to understand and respect the principles of health reform. I have been shown, that means vision, that the principles that were given us in those early days are important as they were then. The principles of healthful living mean a great deal to us individually and as a people. And of course, they do mean a lot to us. I'm not arguing or presenting the fact that they don't, because they do. Just as a side to this, I begin to ask myself, then where did the energy come to drive health reform so vigorously into Adventism? And lo and behold, it's in the review. In 1879, they organized themselves into collective associations, nationally and state by state. Every Adventist was enrolled, and there were lectures and promises and pledges made all throughout Adventism. But it wasn't driven by Ellen White at all or James White. It was driven by John Harvey Kellogg. He was the first president of this association, called the Health and Temperance Association. Now, Don McMahon also used other sources in his research to compare. This seems reasonable to me, although I don't think it's necessary, because if you've determined that the writings of Ellen White are inspired, all you need to do is go in and test those writings and make sure that they are inspired somehow. But he chose to take Sylvester Graham book that was written in 1854, 650 pages, James Jackson in 1862, William A. Alcock in 1857, 424 pages, and Larkin Coles in 1850 with 254 pages, and compare them across to Spiritual Gifts with 31 pages. Well, as a scientist, we have a problem, don't we, for making the comparisons. For the first thing that you notice is these are much older. 1864, most of these people are dead. Coles is dead, Alcock is dead, James Jackson is still alive, but Sylvester Graham is dead. And their publications, while they show up at 1854, in many cases they were first printed in 1830s, so they're old. And he wants to compare this cluster of data to this cluster and determine which one is inspired or not inspired. And then of all things, I argued to him, why did you pick Plain Facts for the Young and Old, written by John Harvey Kellogg in 1888, one of his worst books, to argue that compared to a physician called John Harvey Kellogg, Ellen White was way ahead of him. This book is known to be terribly defective. In Selected Messages, Mrs. White writes, after the vision was given to me, this is June 6, 1863, my husband was aroused upon the health question. Well, I think I've demonstrated to you, have I not, in that graph that the health message started at almost a decade before, and James White was definitely aroused on the health question at least 3 years before this vision. Then she says he obtained the books. These are the books that James White obtained. These are the books that Ron Numbers questions, because Mrs. White says when the books arrived, they were put upon a high shelf in the kitchen in their wrappers, their original wrappers, and I did not open them for a year. But if you go in the review and you start looking for articles that appear after June 3, 1863, they're quoting from these books. They're quoting from Trawl, from Jackson. Jackson comes out in February of 1863. They're quoting from Cole and Graham. So James White at least opened the package and was using the references from these books. Okay, let's go on. Now, I thought it would be important for you, as my budding scientist, to read a little bit of Spiritual Gifts so you can get a feel for the style of writing that Ellen White used. She actually appeals to the people, to the Adventist people, upon the subject of Christian temperance, largely from a biblical standpoint. She uses a lot of examples in the Bible, so much of her health reform is driven by the standards of health in the Bible. I'll read you a little bit of this. Children who eat improperly are often feeble, pale, and dwarfed. We have a number of physicians in the audience. As these go by, tell me if this is true or false. They are nervous, excitable, and irritable. Everything noble is sacrificed to the appetite, and the animal passions predominate. What are animal passions? That's a phrenological term. That's a sexual term. That means these individuals who have these kinds of diets eat improperly, can't control their sex, their drive for sex. That's what that means. And what does the word improperly, what does it mean to eat improperly? Is that very definite? Well, you can see the problem. I really do admire what Don McMahon has attempted to do. It's impossible. For a physician living in the 20th century, reading this archaic language of the 19th century, mid-19th century, is a lot of work. And to tease out principles from this that you can rely upon is a lot of hard work. And it's not just Ellen White. Here's William A. Alcock. Notice the difference in his book called The Laws of Health, which is 424 pages. I've read parts of it, not all of it. There are 2,230 principles in this book. Here's a chapter midway in digestion and nutrition. He says, the common notion of digestion is exceedingly narrow and unworthy. Most parents have a general idea that they live somehow or other by eating, but in what way the food, which is from time to time taken into the stomach, comes to make part of them or their very flesh and bones. They know almost as little as the child did who, when asked what became of his dinner, replied that it had gone into his hands, his arms, his feet, and his legs. So you can see that the style of writing, the communication was fairly simplistic. It was without the scientific basis, although this book is written more as a physiology text than it is a health reform text. But this is one of the books that Don McMahon used in his analysis, comparing the prophet versus as inspired versus the uninspired, non-Adventist writers. Now basically what he has to do is go through these books line by line and try to identify principles that he can use to test against the prophet. So let's see how well Mrs. White does against some of these other writers. And you in the audience, help me out with this one. There's a statement in here by John Gunn, who wrote the book called Domestic Physician. You can still buy it today. At the time of Mrs. White's writing, there were 100,000 copies of this in the population. He started in 1830 versus Mrs. White. Which of these statements came from Mrs. White and which came from John C. Gunn? Well, let's read them. Tobacco is a poison of most deceitful and malignant kind that sends this exciting and paralyzing influence into every nerve of the body. Or, tobacco is a poison of the most deceitful and malignant kind, having an exciting, then a paralyzing influence upon the nerves of the body. This one Ellen White wrote in 1864. This one John Gunn wrote in 1857. Is it possible that the Holy Spirit or the angel, however these visions were communicated to the prophetess, that he had by his side a book that he could look at or pass across? I mean, how did this get so similar between John Gunn and Mrs. White? Let's try another one. Let's go to Larkin Coles, because Ron Numbers uses Larkin Coles simply because the book in John Harvey Kellogg's library was noted on the side where John Harvey Kellogg knew that Mrs. White was copying from Larkin Coles. So let's see which one you would guess is coming from Coles and which one is coming from the prophetess. This leaves a space between these organs which gives a sensation of faintness and sinking at the pit of the stomach, which is often called goneness. Or having no time for rest, the digestive organs become enfeebled, hence the sense of goneness and desire for frequent eating. Which of these is written by Cole, which is written by White? How many think that? Okay. And this is written by Larkin Coles? We have them backwards. Let's try another one. Obedience to the laws of health should be made a matter of individual and personal duty. Or, I have been shown that a great amount of suffering might be saved if all would labor to prevent disease by strictly obeying the laws of health. Well, that one's kind of a giveaway, isn't it? Because Coles wouldn't say I was shown This is Ellen White, this is Coles. But it's referring to the laws of health in its strict obedience. Now, when Don McMahon first began his study, and this has been going on since 1960, and he travels the whole world of Adventism at camp meetings, general conference sessions, Andrews University. I think he's been to Loma Linda, right? Yes. He's been to Loma Linda to teach our doctors how this works. According to Don McMahon, he had difficulty when he first read Ellen White. He says, quote, "In the late 1990s, I decided I would investigate the conundrum of Ellen White's medical writings. He began by reading Ministry of Healing, extracting the health and medical statements, and he found only 2/3 of her statements to be upheld by modern medical knowledge, and that is his own knowledge. So he decided that he would have to break these sentences up into what statements and why statements. Here's an example. At present, she is not prepared to take the extreme position relative to salt, sugar, and milk. A what statement is, do not use salt, sugar, or milk because the prophetess has not made a position known. And what surprised me was, in spiritual gifts, the main revelations of vision, Mrs. White does not address salt or sugar. And the reason here is that by 1870, she wasn't sure how to take a position on these. The common use of salt and sugar is an evil nearly as wretched in its results as the use of flesh meats. 1871. Finally, by 1901, showing the progressive nature of the revelation, I use some salt, she said, and always have from the light given me by God. This article, in the place of being deleterious, is actually essential for the blood. So the principles of health reform weren't just put out on the table. They migrated over time, and of course, by 1864, Ellen White admits that she's using other sources to obtain her health principles. So Don McMahon then created a new form of statement called the whys and wherefores. I found this in Larkin Coles in the Philosophy of Health, where he says, now for the whys and wherefores of these directions. He wasn't sure. But to Don McMahon and Leonard Brand, taking Ellen White's writings and separating them into whats and whys allowed them to take the why as an explanation of the what, and the whys included how the body works, how disease spreads, and what changes occur with disease. Now, what surprised me was that Ellen White actually copied this idea about the whys and wherefores. And she took it from Frederick Kremmacher in his book that was published by the American Tract Society, in which she says, my guide, that's the angel that's talking to her, said, the whys and the wherefores are often concealed from you, and yet speak the words I shall give you. The ways of God leads his people are generally mysterious, which was adapted from Frederick Krummacher, who wrote, the whys and the wherefores are concealed from us. The ways of God leads us are generally mysterious. So this is not even an original, though Don McMahon tries to portray to the readers that he's following Mrs. White in her division of the whats and the whys in making this distinction. And I write, this is what Brand and McMahon say on page 73, quote, it appears to me that the whats and the whys came from different sources of information. Perhaps God gave us the health principles to follow and left it for us to figure out the reasons why they work. Indeed, he could not have explained some of the whys correctly at the time without inventing medical vocabulary and revealing physiological concepts that were not known until decades after Mrs. White wrote her statements. What that means is these scientists have decided that because the whys don't make sense and they're irregular and they're inaccurate, They have to have come from a different source in her writings. But here you have the prophetess writing spiritual gifts, and she, they claim, is separating those inspiration things from the angels, the what statements from the why statements. So let's go in and let's review some of this and see how it works. Let's start by scoring these health messages. And the way that we want to score them is you decide what is what and what is why. And if it's a what statement, is it accurate? And if it is accurate, is it significant? And if it's not accurate, then we will evaluate as not being true and useful to our study. So let's see how well you do here. This is not easy to do, I argue to Don. Quote, for about 6 months, most of the bread upon our table has been unleavened cakes made of unbolted wheat meal and water and a very little salt. I have lived upon 2 meals a day. So the Adventists adopted a 2 meals a day as a what statement. 2 meals a day to the early Adventists was a way to preserve health. Do we today practice 2 meals a day? Some do, yes. So what is the what statement in this statement? Is this a why statement? Let's try another one. Indulging in eating too frequently and in too large quantities, overtaxing the digestive organs, and produces a feverish state of the system. The blood becomes impure, and then diseases of various kinds occur. Is that an accurate statement? Is it a significant statement? Is it an inaccurate statement? Coffee and tea are stimulating. Their effects are similar to those of tobacco, but they affect in a less degree. Well, is it true that coffee and tea are stimulating? Yes, okay. So that's a what statement? Presumably, because the effects are similar to those of tobacco. Are they similar to tobacco? The eating of pork has produced scrofola or tuberculosis, leprosy, and cancerous humors. Is that a true statement? You can see the problem, can't you? Okay, so when Don got through with his taking these statements into whats and whys, he came up with 44 or 46 what statements in spiritual gifts, and he found that about 70% of them were verified and significant. That another 26% were verified and minor, that is, they don't really affect your health, and then about 4% were unverified. Whereas when Mrs. White moved over to after spiritual gifts between 1864 and 1906, her verity dropped from 70% to 40%. Then it went back up to 50%, 56% in ministry of healing. So it looks like these set of statements, these what statements, although they're not as many as over here in the ministry of healing, it looks like that these are more accurate than later on when Mrs. White continued to write out her health messages. And these are the closest to the vision. These, of course, have been polluted by the writings of other health reformers. That's his argument. But what I noticed was this. When I looked at his data in 1960, his whats were only 20% accurate, significant and verifiable. But by the year 2000, the same set of whats had increased to 56%. And then by 2006, about the time he arrived at Loma Linda University, they're up to 70%. And recently, in a publication at Andrews University where he laid out his data, it's at 96%. So what is showing the pattern of inspiration? Are the statements maturing across time? Is he changing his evaluation methods? Is he becoming better educated? Well, the way he explained it to me is when he's out giving his talks to people, when they see 56%, they say, well, the Holy Spirit's not doing very well. So what does he have to do? They need to be boistered. So they move to 70%. Now he gets more speaking engagements. I actually, before I saw these numbers, I could predict when he would hit 100%. Okay. Here's his scoring space. On Sylvester Graham, 23% were significant, 15 for Alcock, 23 for Coles, Jackson, so forth. Mrs. White the first time was 26%. By the year 2000, went to 56%. So I said to myself, what's going on? So I went into these because he provides a CD of his work. I went in and found that 8 of these were duplicated. They were the same ones. I found that 12 of those were errors or irrelevant. 11 were minor. Only 13 of the total 46 were actually significant. So his real numbers should have been 36 and remained at 36. So in our language of science, or in history, we call this cooking the books. Here's the non-inspired writers. Graham, Alcock, Coles, and Jackson compared to Ellen White across here. These, as I've mentioned, are in the low, around the 20s. But he didn't go back and reevaluate those. He only reevaluated Ellen White. So he's motivated to keep increasing the findings of Ellen White. On the why statements for Ellen White, he claims there's no evidence of inspiration, and it clearly appears to be copied, unquote. I, for the life of me, cannot understand how the Review and Herald, the Pacific Press, and anybody allows him to come and speak before an audience and claim that Ellen White has inspired what statements, but none inspired why statements. And in fact, the line that shows here, which I drew myself across his data, shows that the why statements are supporting statements, and they're growing in their significance, but they don't get any higher than about 50%, because the knowledge of physiology and health reform is also growing during this time, and that's all that reflects. Well, let's go to appeals to mother. This data he left out. I have been shown that children who practice self-indulgence previous to puberty or the period of emerging into manhood and womanhood must pay the penalty of nature's violated laws at a critical time. So listen, look and see what is true about secret vice on health in individuals. We'll start with the males from ages 15 to 30. Notice that if a person only practices self-abuse one time a month, in terms of the cancers, humors, and rheumatism, and neuroglia, and liver disease, there's not much that takes place. But as the frequency of self-abuse goes up, notice that rheumatism jumps quite a bit, cancers, humors a little bit, neuroglia is going up. Individuals who practice this from 3 to 4 times a week, still rheumatism is going up. Cancers, humors in these individuals is rising. Liver disease is on the increase. And from 6 to 12 times a week, liver disease jumps here, but for some reason, rheumatism is cured. It drops down. And I wasn't able to explain that. Let's look at females from ages 15 to 30 on the results of secret vice. Now, females possess less vital force than the males. So, in terms of head decays inward, as Mrs. White describes it, catarrh, dropsy, or lost memory, a few symptoms begin to show up. If it goes from 1 to 2 times a week, catarrh is on the increase, head decays, inward deformities are inward. going up. Children should not be allowed to make eggs their diet, for this kind of food, eggs and animal flesh, feeds and inflames the animal passions. As you can see here, 3 to 4 times a week. Head decays are way up. Catarrh is not so bad, but memory loss is increasing. And by the time you get to 8 to 12 times a week, the habit once formed is more difficult to overcome than the appetite for liquor or for tobacco. Look how much memory loss is occurring in women on the ages of 15 to 30 practicing solitary vice from 8 to 12 times a week. Catarrh is down. Head decays, deformities of every kind is down. Well, let me confess something to you. This is all made up. None of this data exists. So if Ellen White saw this was going to happen, and it doesn't happen, what do you conclude? So I contacted Ron Numbers and told him about what I was doing, and he gave me an email from Don McMahon, which I'm quoting, and will reveal to you, my audience, what the situation is. Quote, he's writing to Ron Numbers, and he says, I have shown that she wrote in the knowledge base and needs of the time she was writing. Many in the church have had and are still having great difficulty in coming to grips to refute my work with what I have concluded. There's been a lot of effort to refute my work from the conservative side of the church, and they have failed so far. I feel that the reason that my level of inspiration has been so well accepted is not only the work of Graham Bradford of Avondale and Alden Thompson of Walla Walla College, but also because of your work, Ron Numbers. If they could refute what you have done, they would not have accepted my work. So it is because of you that I have been welcomed as a satisfactory compromise between the two extremes on inspiration as expressed by Ellen White. And yet he still continues to travel the country documenting these results. Well, when it came to the question of literary dependency, Don and Brand quote on page 62 of their book, we know that she read the publications of other health reformers, at least after writing Spiritual Gifts. Her copies of these books contain her underlining and other markings. In addition, sometimes she used the wording found in these other Reformed publications in her own works. This occurs often enough to indicate clear that she was familiar with them and that they influenced her wording as she wrote. So is Brandon McMahon telling us that Ellen White is literally dependent upon other health reformers from their study? Or over here in McMahon, he says, when we compare the significant Watts of each of these health writers in historical succession, we see progress. As a starting point, 23% of the Watts suggested by Graham were considered to be significant. Alcock lifted these to 26% of those he borrowed from Graham. In turn, Coles lifted this to 32% of those he borrowed from Graham. Again, Jackson lifted this to 39% he borrowed from Graham, Alcock, and Coles. And Ellen White lifted the mark to 62% in what she may have borrowed from Graham, Alcock, Coles, and Jackson. So McMahon is saying to his readers in this book, and the surprising thing to me is that no one seems to catch on to this or understand what he's saying. So let's ask the question, did Brand and McMahon establish the supernatural from this study that they conducted? Well, McMahon says recently, a probability of 1 times 10 to the 20th, that's fallen now from 28 to 20, that will continue to go down if I keep pressing him, that it could not be achieved by random chance. Well, who in the world ever considered that Ellen White was collecting her information by random chance? That's like taking a book and just thumbing it and putting your finger and writing from that. Thumbing and writing. She didn't do that. She's reading the material and selecting, she and James and others are selecting what's good. This is what Leonard Brand says. Quote, and this again is profound. The results of this research have refuted hypothesis C1. Hypothesis C1 says Ellen White's health concepts can be satisfactorily explained as borrowed from the other health reformers of her day. So he claims that he's refuted this when he told us as we went along that there was literary footprints throughout her work. We can't satisfactorily explain Ellen White's lifestyle principles by suggesting that she borrowed them from other health reformers. Divine inspiration best explains the data. That's the God of the gap argument. In conclusion, and I use their own writing, this, every time you see a quotation, I'm taking this from their book. Quote, it is evident that most of what Mrs. White wrote had been used before. Mrs. White had extracted the vast majority of her World Health Organization's verified Watts from the combined work of Graham, Alcock, Coles, and Jackson. And he only used 2 of the proper books of the 4 from that James White had ordered and that were in the home of Ellen White and James. Mrs. White is clearly convinced that the information in spiritual gifts came by inspiration. McMahon and Brand don't think so because the whys came from a different source than the inspiration or the divine from the whats. Where Ellen White thought she copied, she did no better than what would be expected when compared with the knowledge of her time. And finally, it seems probable that the Adventist lifestyle was more than the work done in the middle of the 19th century by an uneducated young woman who had no medical knowledge. Finally, let's take the writings from an individual who was contemporary with Ellen White and see what was really taking place. I quote from J.N. Wagner, Review and Herald, August 7, 1866, 2 years after the health writings of Ellen White. Quote, we do not profess to be pioneers in the general principles of health reform. The facts on which this movement is based have been elaborated in a great measure by reformers, physicians, and writers on physiology and hygiene, and so may be found scattered through the land. But we do claim that by the method of God's choice, it has been made more clearly and powerfully unfolded and is thereby producing an effect which we could not have looked for from any other means, and so declared to be the means whereby a weak people may be made strong to overcome and fitted for translation. In other words, if we do this well and we get perfect in our health practices, Jesus will come and we will be translated. If we don't, as John Harvey Kellogg argued, we have to die first, go through the Underground Railroad, and then we get to heaven. Then it comes to us an essential part of present truth to be received with the blessing of God or rejected at our peril. Well, what did you decide, members of the august scientific community or historians in the audience? Did they prove their point in this research? Or were you satisfied with the evidence that I have shown you that they have been able to establish the hallmarks of good scientific research? Thank you very much.